All right, hello, good afternoon. I'm here to talk about this guy, Julian Assange, and what's happening to him at the moment. The story behind this started some time ago, and I'm not going to assume that you're totally familiar with the story. So I apologize if some of what I'm going to say right at the beginning of this is repetitious for you, but it's sort of when you take a step back and think about what's happened, it's kind of a crazy story. So in some ways it's worth hearing it again, I think. Julian Assange, for those who don't know, is the technological visionary behind a publishing operation called WikiLeaks. His intellectual formation is in the cypherpunks movement of the early 90s, which is exactly where Bitcoin came from as well. WikiLeaks came to prominence in 2010 through a series of epochal disclosures of US government information. This was about these document archives were about really important subjects like war and peace and the history of diplomacy and where power resides in international affairs. The whistleblower behind this was Chelsea Manning. And Chelsea Manning got the information to WikiLeaks by submitting it online through an anonymous submission system. That was the technological innovation behind WikiLeaks. Everybody agrees that the archives that WikiLeaks published in 2010 are incredibly important. They are still part of the standard historical reference material for anyone who writes on international affairs. Despite them being so important, incidentally, we know for a fact that had WikiLeaks not published them, they wouldn't have been published at all. And we know this because Chelsea Manning tried to go to different places. She tried to go to the New York Times and Washington Post, and they weren't having any of it. They weren't fussed. As well as improving knowledge of international affairs for the long term, the WikiLeaks revelations totally changed journalism, completely. Every media organization seems to have its own anonymous Dropbox these days, and that's thanks to WikiLeaks, obviously. All of those collaborations you see around large document archives, the Snowden revelations, the Panama Papers, all of them, that's thanks to the model set by WikiLeaks too. And I guess I should say that WikiLeaks didn't publish these 2010 documents on their own. They published them in partnership with a host of media organizations, some of the most famous media organizations in the world. The New York Times, The Guardian, Der Spiegel, El País. Even more important than the revolution in journalism, though, the publications of 2010, those document archives from the US government, they sparked off the biggest political and cultural change it's possible to imagine, I think, from a set of public interest disclosures. In particular, they were part of the fuel that sparked off the Arab Spring, and thereby the wave of revolutions and grassroots democratic movements that swept the world from 2010 through to 2012. It's pretty big stuff. Everybody agrees that the documents that were published in 2010 were incredibly important. Everybody does. Despite that, the publication did make some people in the US government quite unhappy. And in the wake of the publications, they arrested Chelsea Manning, they tortured Chelsea Manning, and they sentenced her to 35 years in prison. She didn't serve 35 years in prison, they released her belatedly, but she's now back in prison for pretty much the same reason. The Obama administration also initiated a criminal investigation into WikiLeaks. There was a grand jury running for many, many years. And in 2012, Julian Assange was granted political asylum because of the threat of prosecution from the United States for publishing true information that was in the public interest. As it turns out, it seems that the Obama administration decided sometime in 2015 or something like that they couldn't prosecute Julian Assange because if they did that, if they prosecuted WikiLeaks, it would also be prosecuting the New York Times, who also published the same information at the same time. And so, even though the Obama administration was horrific to whistleblowers, just as they were terrible to hackers, this attacking the New York Times, attacking the media full on, was not a path they wanted to go down. But it's a different administration in the United States now. And for the Trump administration, the fact that prosecuting WikiLeaks is also prosecuting the New York Times is a feature. It's not a bug. So the Trump administration picked up the prosecution of Julian Assange and decided to run with it. On the 11th of April this year, Julian was expelled from the Ecuadorian embassy, where he'd been sheltering for the past 7 years under political asylum. His asylum was withdrawn, and he was arrested immediately. And as soon as he was arrested, a US extradition request was unsealed, which is exactly what he'd been warning about for years and years and years. Julian is now in Belmarsh prison. That's a horrible prison in a horrible bit of southeast London. It's a horrible bit of southeast London. And he's on the medical ward because after 10 years of unrelenting pressure, which most of us, I think, could not deal with, he's not very well. And he is facing his first extradition hearing in spring next year. Now, why, might you ask? Why does this matter to me more than the ways in which it obviously matters to everyone? Well, let me try and talk to you about that, and I think that maybe the way for me to talk to you about that is about why it's important to me in my work, and then I'll do my best to relate it to you. So, I work in whistleblowing. I work for an organisation called Blueprint for Free Speech. We do a lot of research in whistleblowing and policy work, and I guess what I'm doing is advocacy, so we do a bit of advocacy as well, right? Just to give you an idea of the things we do, this is a project we're doing at the moment called Expanding Anonymous Tipping, EAT, a project funded by the European Commission. We are setting up 250 anonymous drop boxes across 11 EU countries with 10 NGO partners, setting up drop boxes for public institutions and private organisations, setting up these whistleblower channels and watching what happens and comparing different results and seeing how these channels are used. It's a big, important project, and we're doing research which nobody has done before. I think it goes without saying that not only this project wouldn't exist without WikiLeaks, but this whole research agenda would not exist without WikiLeaks. Earlier this year, the European Commission, the European institutions passed a whistleblower directive. So very, very important, this means that whistleblowers will have a pretty decent standard of legal protection throughout as at the moment, 28 EU member states, including in this country, Germany, where no whistleblower protection at all exists at present. It's a pretty big deal. Pretty big deal, quite a success. Blueprint was one of more than 80 civil society organizations working on this, and what we did is actually a pretty good model for those who are interested on how you generate good progressive change on the EU level. I'm proud of what we did, it was good. This too would not have happened without Julian Assange, who totally revolutionized how we think about whistleblowing. Now, one of the ironies of this situation is that if the whistleblower directive had not passed in the same week that Julian was arrested, I don't think his name would have been connected with it at all. And this is emblematic of the position he occupies, actually, because he's in the unenviable position of being both too controversial and too obvious at the same time to be given the credit that he deserves. That's happened a lot. It's not an isolated example. Okay. I want to talk to you about the threats he's facing in more detail, but before I do that, because I promised I'd do that, let me relate what I've just said to you. When we talk about whistleblowing, we also often talk about what the positive impacts that whistleblowers have done, how important they are, and how they need protection. And yes, whistleblowers should be protected because coming forward with important information in the public interest should not end your life, and it's ruined so many lives. So legal protections for whistleblowers are really important. But let me give you another way of thinking about this, because in the academic literature, we don't always just talk about whistleblowing, we talk about whistleblowers as an integral part of integrity systems. What's an integrity system? Imagine you have an organization. Organizations have issues, right? And the bigger an organization gets, the more issues it has. Hopefully, if something's well run, you hope it can deal with its issues internally, but sometimes that's not the case. One good way of getting an organization to deal with difficult issues is to put in a channel, a route, so that people who have concerns, sometimes we call these people whistleblowers, can raise those concerns in a safe way. That means that they're not going to lose their job or ruin their career. And then hopefully, those concerns will be dealt with within the organization. You can sort things out. Brilliant. Sometimes, you can't sort problems out that way. The organization can't do it, or it's too embedded, or there's something going very wrong. And in those cases, it's often something quite serious. That's not all of cases, by the way. It's like definitely less than 10%. But there's something very serious going on that maybe the public needs to know about. And in that case, the organization can't deal with it. Maybe that's something that the whistleblower should let the media know about. And so being criticized by the media is quite annoying, right? But it's a pretty efficient way of being embarrassed into sorting out your problems if they're resolvable. What I've just described is a system of self-regulation, which is credible because it has an external check on it. Where you have credible systems of self-regulation, which are cost-effective, you do not need to get external regulators involved, external regulators who do not perfectly understand the business you're dealing in and are particularly susceptible to being bought by outside interests. When we talk about whistleblowing, we're talking about credible systems of self-regulation. Now maybe it's a little bit more obvious, right? So let me talk about the dangers that Julian is facing for provoking a revolution in the way we think about those systems of self-regulation and actually adapting them to the world we live in so that they're really useful for everyone, for doing that enormous public service. The charges that Julian is facing from the United States are kind of unprecedented in their breadth and their scope and their severity. It faces one conspiracy charge to deal with journalist source communications, conversations with Chelsea Manning, and 17 charges under the Espionage Act. And just to reiterate, we're talking about publishing true material in the public interest, so it's kind of weird that they're using the Espionage Act against that, isn't it? All in all, that looks like a potential sentence of 175 years in prison, if he got that far, which you shouldn't take for granted because he's not well. If you've followed this at all, you will certainly have heard about what a clear and present danger this prosecution presents for the free media. And all of that is completely true. What is at stake is this. If Julian is prosecuted in the United States, it means that the US reserves the right to punish or end the life, basically, of anyone who dares publish material that is displeasing to it, even though it is, clearly in the public interest, in not a way that anyone reasonable would argue with. If he is extradited to the United States, it means that the UK thinks that the Trump administration's position on the press, that the press are the enemies of the people, is a reasonable one. It means that anyone who publishes anything displeasing to the United States has that blade hanging over their head. It's extraordinarily bad and extraordinarily serious. And that's not even all there is to this. In the conspiracy charge that was unveiled on the 11th of April, it was part of the conspiracy that Assange and Manning used the Jabber online chat service. Using end-to-end encryption, because of course they mean Jabber with OTR here, is sort of treated as an aggravating factor in this indictment. I find that quite worrying. In the Espionage Act indictment, there is language unlawfully conspired with other co-conspirators known and unknown, which is setting a target directly on those who are not involved in publishing, but were involved in support actions around publishing. And with those of us who are looking at this situation closely, we are firmly of the opinion that they're talking about people who are helping in technological ways the process of publishing. Do not be under any illusions. What is happening to Julian Assange is also a sideways attack on this community and everything you believe in. I'm not just speculating about this because it started already. This is Ola Binney. Ola's a friend of Julian's. He's a Swedish national who lives in Ecuador. He's a privacy researcher. On the 11th of April, the same day Julian was arrested, Ola was also arrested. He spent 2 months in a really disgusting Ecuadorian prison without charge of any kind. We can't really talk about the prosecution of Ola Binney because 4.5 months after his arrest, prosecutors in Ecuador have yet to come up with any reason why he should have been arrested in the first place. They've just not done it yet. It's a persecution, right? It's not a prosecution. Earlier this month, the EFF went out to Ecuador on a fact-finding mission, and they have concluded that what happened and is still happening to Ola is politically motivated. No charges have yet been laid, but he can't leave Ecuador for the moment while the process is going on. At some point, we have to say stop, or things are going to get totally out of control. And this is one of those moments. Julian Assange's first extradition hearing is in spring this year. If there is one thing I would like you to remember from what I'm telling you today, it's that his extradition to the United States is not a foregone conclusion. It's not. And I know it's not because other people have beaten this before. This is my friend Lauri Love. Lauri Love is a British-Finnish computer scientist, pen tester these days, and Lauri was facing extradition to the United States. US prosecutors in 3 different judicial districts wanted to extradite him and put him in prison for 99 years. Why? Because US prosecutors thought that Lauri Love had been part of an online protest against the heavy-handed behavior of US prosecutors. And if that sounds really sick, it's because it was. This picture is from February last year, which is when Lauri Love won his appeal against extradition to the United States. And you know, I feel that I can speak with some authority about UKUS extradition because keeping Lauri Love in the UK, keeping him alive, was my campaign. And look, given what I know, given how extradition works, given how the political factors weigh up, given how awkward I know the British government already feels about this extradition, because look, they wouldn't have staged a stupid global media conference earlier this year if they weren't feeling acutely insecure about it. They wouldn't have staged a global media conference in which they banned people from giving unmoderated questions from the floor if they weren't feeling acutely embarrassed and wary about it. I think we can stop Julian Assange being extradited to the United States. But if we're going to do that, we need to put in place at least the things that we had for Lauri Love. It's going to take all of the communities who have an interest in Julian not being extradited. I would say humbly that that includes this community I'm speaking to now. It includes privacy activists, it includes anti-imperialists, it includes people who are interested in a free press, it includes like the whistleblowing community where I'm working, it includes all of us. We all have an interest in not seeing Julian Assange extradited. And this is the place where we have to stop it because this is the only place we can stop it. And diversity, bringing people together, is a bonus, it's an asset in these situations, because if you want to stop someone being extradited, and I've done it, you need to play it from as many angles as you possibly can. Let me give you a few examples of what we did for Lauri, and it's just going to be media stuff. We did other stuff as well, right? So, the Daily Mail is a very right-wing paper in the UK. Lowry Love is not natural material for the Daily Mail. He's a self-confessed anarchist. You know, he's not really natural Daily Mail material. But they got behind him. They actually campaigned for him, and they covered it a lot. And this is quite a late clipping. I could have chosen a few of them. This is quite a late clipping, and it's taking it from like quite a Brexity point of view, right? It's all about British sovereignty and securing our independence from the United States. Former top prosecutor Lord MacDonald says this is all about British independence. Great. Now, okay, fair enough. The Daily Mail has been involved in other extradition campaigns in the past, so maybe, you know, while this is cool and it was good and it helped a lot, maybe that's not mega surprising. Let me show you something that might be more surprising. The Financial Times covered Lowry's extradition a lot. Every time he had a hearing, it seems, they put his picture on the front page. Kind of surprising, maybe slightly counterintuitive. Let me explain to you why they did that. The rule of law is necessary for commercial activity, right? Because where do you base contracts on? Otherwise, how do you deal with people? What do you do? And if you don't have control of your own national laws, what happens to innovation? Why would people work and invest in the UK? The Financial Times, the editors of the Financial Times, recognised that if Lowry were extradited on sort of bullshit computer crimes charges, this would be a massive threat to the cybersecurity industry in the UK. And this is why they covered his case so intensively, here interviewing him about how hackers can help companies. Let me give you another example, because this is all sort of, we're persuading people who might not necessarily agree with us on everything stuff. Okay, but let me give you another example of where we played more hardball. This is also in the FT, where we had incontrovertible evidence that the UK authorities had been treating Lowry Love badly, breaking the rules, bending the rules, treating him unfairly. We went to town on that. We made it as embarrassing as we possibly could for them. And, you know, like, it's the UK, it's like kind of there's sort of a politeness thing. People never come out on the streets for everything. So look, like a really critical blog from like a respected legal blogger is pretty hardball for organisations in the UK. So we did that. We hit it as hard as we possibly could. If we are going to save Julian, we need to do at least as much as we did to save Lowry. And one of my concerns at the moment is this kind of stuff, which is kind of basic stuff in some ways, is not being done. There's time to rectify this, but actually the time is getting kind of tight. And that worries me a little bit about this situation too. But if we do rectify it, and we do the things that need to be done, I'm pretty sure that we could win. That's worth fighting for. There are some moments where you just need to say stop in order to stop everything becoming much, much worse. Julian Assange's prosecution by the United States is one such moment, and we're lucky in a way that there's a UK extradition process in the middle of it, because that is a process that we can influence. It's been done before. We can do it, but the work needs to start now, and it really needs your help. Thank you.